Okay, go ahead.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We're kind of encompassing the globe again today. Welcome to the KAATSU Alpha weekly meeting. We're doing this weekly during this COVID shelter in place when everybody has tons of free time. But we have a really cool guest with us today for kind of a KAATSU interview with his experience with KAATSU and how he's used it in his sport. Coach Jonty Skinner is joining us today. Coach, he's a former world record holder, NCAA champion, International Hall of Famer, was a coach at Alabama for a long time. And Jonty has worked with a lot of emerging technology in the sport of swimming. And I think that's really why Stephen and Jonty's relationship with respect to KAATSU has really blossomed over the years. I don't want to steal any of Coach Skinner's thunder, but that is our guest today. Jonty, it's awesome to have you on board today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, you're welcome. And, you know, I've known Steve for eons, for a long time. So, you know, I was always something, you know, you're right about me. I've always been someone that has been very interested in anything that is new or different or could change how we see the sport or how we develop the sport or develop athletes. And I'm always looking for that next paradigm that I think is going to make a difference in the long run. And, you know, from my initial introduction to it with John and Steve in Florida that very first time, and some of the initial uses that I used it for in Alabama, it really evolved to some degree to how I used it in Indiana. So, and I spent a year in Indiana kind of with the new devices, the really more portable little boxes that I thought were really convenient. But my transition went from more of a training kind of tool to more of a skill adaptation tool. So today I'm going to talk more about how I use it in skill adaptation. And to preface that is to understand how the brain manages movement, how the brain really, I try to teach athletes that even though they're athletes and they think of the heart and lungs as the most important organs that we use in performance, the reality is it's actually the most important organ is the brain. Because the more exposure, the more opportunity we give the brain exposure to the patterns of movement that they want to use or will utilize in racing and how to manage that pattern of movement, the more skilled it is at reproducing what you want when you're at the point where you want it the most, which is in racing. So in my line of work as a college coach, I found that pretty much 90% of the athletes that came into my environment needed to learn new skills. And in some cases, I had to reteach them how to swim freestyle. Like they just didn't understand it. Their technique was, to use a euphemism, abysmal. And, you know, it was just start from scratch. And the way the brain works is the brain wants to be on autopilot. We think of the left and right hemispheres as controlling left and right side actions of the body. But the reality is the left hemisphere controls everything that we know. Basically, it's the automation center of all the skill that we know. The right hemisphere is all about exploration. It's metaphor, it's music, it's a whole different environment. And in the process of skill acquisition, when you learn something new, a completely new pattern, you have to trick the brain into getting into the right hemisphere, which is a challenge in itself because it doesn't want to do that. It just wants to do what it knows. And once you trick it to get in there to learn new patterns, now you're in the process of teaching the brain how to manage a completely new pattern at the adult stage, which requires probably a time frame of anywhere from 6 months if you're extremely lucky to probably out to almost 2 years before that skill acquisition can be honed into where it becomes automated and becomes very good, and you can build strength, power, and performance in that new pattern. So it takes a long time. I've done this many, many times with athletes, and I have a very strong repertoire of tricks and tools in my toolbox that I use to trick the brain to learn something new. But as KAATSU evolved in this past year, I kind of evolved into how I used KAATSU. And this is the way I was using it. If I was, I'm going to push the computer back a little, but if I had learned to do a pattern of movement that was only in this direction, and I had to change that completely and change it to more of a cutting direction. Now this is completely new. And as my brain began to learn how this new cutting direction was managed, the iterations of paths that it might follow would be very wide, which means there'd be a lot of noise associated with the pattern, which would create a lot of loss of energy and power. So the drive on my end was to create an environment where I could accelerate the brain's process of learning the acquisition of the pattern and hone it down to where it was exactly the same pattern every time. Because once you get there and the brain can manage the movement, it reduces the number of motor units associated with managing the movement, cost goes down, and then eventually builds strength and power on top of that. I have found that in order to accelerate the process of skill acquisition, I use a concept called contrast training. So in contrast training, what I do is I put the athletes into the environment where I provide resistance, and I slow the pattern down to where it's meticulous, to where they are very meticulous about following a specific pattern of movement with resistance, because the brain is very, very much better at learning with resistance back there. And then I might put little tricks or tools in there to add to make the brain think, okay, this is clearly something new. I have to really focus on what I'm doing so that I can master this new pattern, because I want to get this down because I don't want to have to deal with it anymore. So by adding resistance to the movement, what I did was I would marry the contrast between perfect, resistant, meticulous patterns, and then I'd flip right from that to high intensity swimming. So race intensity swimming. So the same pattern, but extremely fast. And I asked the swimmers not to kind of focus specifically on what that pattern was, because I didn't want them to do that. I didn't want them to be encumbered by it. I just wanted to have a sense of, okay, this is what I want to do, and then let them go. And what I found that is by contrast training, that the process of learning the new pattern or adapting or acquiring the new skill was enhanced. It was accelerated. So then I became said, wait a second, if I add the KAATSU to the slow, meticulous pattern and did the KAATSU in that phase, and then took KAATSU off and put them into that high intensity fast swimming, what it did was it really helped the swimmer coming off the KAATSU. Not only did they feel good, which in my mind had a cognitive, mind-based component. This feels really good. But it also, in my opinion, just added to that process of acceleration, because the worst thing that happens when you make a change with an athlete and you try to put them into an environment where you're learning a skill acquisition that is new, it is similar to what you wanted it to be, but it's new enough to where it creates a difference in opportunity and potential. But it's close enough to where the brain says, no, 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 I really want this. This doesn't interest me at all. So if you employ and you get environments where the actual cognitive thinking mind actually says, oh, actually, I think this feels good, I like it. It makes the brain a little more aware of like, okay, maybe it's something we should keep. We should learn how to understand this and keep it. So by adding the KAATSU to that element of contrast training during the methodical resistance phase, I feel like I was enhancing the process of learning. Now, hopefully that made sense. If anyone has any questions about it, this is where I found on a performance level and folks, I use it for recovery. I use it for athletes to get ready to race. I've used it in a lot of different areas that are normal ways that we use KAATSU. But this was the most recent way I was employing it in terms of skill acquisition and the rationale behind why I used it that way for skill acquisition.
Thank you very much, Jonty. I have a question. So you've already obviously been focused on swimmers, which just swimming is a very technical movement. You're also golfing now, a sport that isn't your chosen line of work. Could you use it for everything from golfing to, let's say, physical rehabilitation if you've got total knee replacement or what have you?
I absolutely. I think to me, it's a combination of that, the physical, right? How the brain kind of deals with the circumstance that you're dealing with, right? So this is the physical brain dealing with any circumstance. And then this relationship of that cognitive thinking mind, that the psychology of the situation that adds to the element of, if someone feels good, it becomes important. And if it's important, the brain is going to take notice of it. So to me, like as a golfer, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm 6'5". So golfing, it's more for like people around 6 feet, somewhere in that range, because it's a little more compact, movement's easier to manage. I played golf with a very good baseball player the other day, and I said, okay, give me the news. What's worse, trying to deal with a 100-mile-an-hour fastball or hitting a golf ball? And he just shook his head. He said, this is no contest. It's hitting a golf ball. He said, and the worst thing about it is the golf ball's just sitting there. So, I've been, as trying to learn this game of golf and becoming better at it, I know and understand that I have to develop a process of a pattern of takeaway and movement, which is all over the place, especially when you're 6'5". Those iterations are huge, and I'm just learning how takeaway and patterns are involved in steering the ball in the right direction kind of thing. But to me, if I kind of work my swing plane without even a golf ball, I don't even need a golf ball there. I just need to be working with the patterns, with right resistance on KAATSU, and then take everything off and come back to swinging at the speeds that I need to swing at. Because when I swing slow patterns, I can really manipulate and control the pattern versus not with the pattern. So I feel like, it has both this physiological, neurological, and then on the same end, if you kind of understand how it works with athletes, this whole psychological, cognitive thinking, feel-good process that, to give you an example, the very first time I asked a swimmer to put KAATSU bands on I said, you can wear them for 10 minutes in the warm-up. At the time, we were working with a KAATSU's pressure of about 2/3 of her normal working pressure. And I said, just put them on your legs, watch the clock, do your normal warm-up, take them off after 10 minutes. She did. She put them on the side of the deck. She came out after warm-up. She goes, oh my God, I feel awesome. I just feel freaking awesome. Now, was that KAATSU, or was that the cognitive thinking mind saying, we're going to kick ass today? To me, you cannot have one without the other. You cannot be exclusive in the physical, neural side and not, encounter what this cognitive thinking, psychological side is adding to the equation.
One other question. Can you give us a practical example at least in the swimming world? What are these sets that you're doing from the, reducing the noise that we encounter to a high intensity? Are you talking like 400 meters something and then 400s, or what are you talking about?
No. In a non-KAATSU environment. So if they don't have KAATSU on, and I could work on the entire spectrum of swimming. So, swimming at slow speeds all the way up to swimming at race speeds, there's this curve, there's this continuum, and you have to be sort of on the path of that continuum. So I would do something like 4 to 625s with resistance, maybe with small paddles on, methodical, perfect patterns of movement with total focus. A lot of times if they're freestyles, there's a snorkel on, so they don't have to worry about dealing with breathing or anything else. And then they just focus on the perfect patterns. And then I flip that, and I would do maybe 475s if I'm working with a VO2 max level with the appropriate amount of rest, and then come back and do it again. Just do it again. Just flip flop between the two. And that's working with a VO2 max environment. If I wanted to do a pure speed environment or race rate type environment, then I would do the resistance, and then they would be swimming 25s at race rate. And I would keep the load, the contrast levels, probably the resistance levels somewhere between 100 and 150 yards, always in 25s. And then the performance side, depending on the energy system I'm trying to hit, I might be out as far as 875s if I'm looking at the endurance kind of cardiovascular component, all the way down to 4 to 625s if I'm looking at the speed component. So it would depend on what component I'm working on. But that's where I would do it in a non-KAATSU. When I included the KAATSU to it, I only work with the speed side. I didn't do the endurance side. I never had time enough to play with the speed side because the idea didn't really click into my mind until late October, late November, early December, when I was actually changing gears and starting to get my athletes really into that race rate, you know, getting the brain exposure to just being able to manage race rate with new patterns, new power, new strength, new, you know, things, and just honing that side in prior to performance at the Big Tens, and then nothing happened beyond that. So it's an area that I think is really worth exploration, more than I've even explored it. But I've spent a lot of time really studying neuroscience, and mostly on it. And don't get confused, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a person that has read a lot about neuroscience. And in my mind, as a swimming coach, I feel like it is truly the next paradigm in performance, because when you truly understand how the brain manages and organizes and deals with patterns of movement, then you change gears on how you train people, because you now understand, okay, I'm not training the heart and the lungs, they sort of byproduct. I'm now training the brain, and I'm training the brain how to manage all these other things. And then you create the environments where you expose the brain to all the elements that it needs to be exposed to in order to put itself in a position where the expectation and the anticipation on race day meets your goal performance.
Got it. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, it's John here. I was not expecting at all to hear you as a coach talking about things like neuroplasticity and neuromuscular pathway stuff. But it's fascinating because we have not just a lot of people in the human performance realm, but a lot of people that deal exactly what you're talking about with the right brain, left brain, and its effect on performance. And we see in the world I came from a lot of blast exposure, minor TBI, major TBI, all these things that affect neuromuscular pathway. So to hear you talk about how you approach contrast training, could we maybe go back to that really quick? You said when you're doing it without KAATSU, you would do 4 to 6 25s at a slow speed, working on perfect form. And then for the VO2 max or the aerobic component, you would do, for example, 475s. And then you said a little later, when you do it with KAATSU, did I understand you right? You eliminate that aerobic piece and focus on the not sprints, because you're doing them. What exactly are you doing during those 25s?
John, it really happened because, to be honest with you, when I moved up to Indiana, I didn't have access to KAATSU until October, late October.
Okay.
And really, if I'd had it at that time, I would have employed it with the 75s.
Okay, so it was
right?
more
So
of a
it was
time
more,
available.
Correct. So it happened
Okay.
later on, and really, because I'm one of these people that are always evolving and thinking. And when I learn something new, like I'm just reading, I'm just in the process of reading a book called Physical Intelligence, which I find really intriguing and interesting. You know, and then all these thoughts and these notes that I write down as the big book evolves, and then I go back and look at stuff from before. So, you know, it took me a while to kind of come back and say, okay. Contrast training came out of a book called Motor Cortex. And that concept was really more about the sport of baseball. It had nothing really to do with swimming. But in reading it, it made a lot of, increased my understanding of, because I'm always in this process of helping kids learn to manage better movement, skill acquisition type thing. It made absolute sense to me. So, in putting KAATSU, marrying KAATSU into that process made a lot of sense and didn't come till late. That's why, you know, I never went more than 4 to 625s to do the pattern rehearsal. And then I never really went, you know, more than, you know, with the KAATSU, more than 4 to 625s, just working at velocity. And this would be the sort of sequence that I would go. I would do a KAATSU sequence of 425s where they have the resistance. And then I'd flip them out of that and I'd put 1 pound weights on their wrists. And I would make them some 425s at weight velocity with 1 pound weights on their wrists, because I feel like it is just getting the brain to deal with different dynamics.
Right.
Then I'd chill, come back and add some KAATSU with the same format, and then go back to weights with fins and paddles. So then just keeping them just different things at that velocity, getting very comfortable with it, and then come back and do it with nothing on, to where I maybe go the first 225s with the equipment on, and then the last 225s with nothing on, to slowly take the brain out of dealing with these other elements while performing at this high intensity at race velocity, and then taking them down to race velocity. I think when they got to those last 225s, you know, they just felt good. They just, after you take the weights off and then you start swimming, you feel good. So I was marrying the feel good that you get from KAATSU to the feel good that you get after using weights, to this whole cognitive belief system that just says, this is awesome.
And you've potentially fired up a whole
You
separate
do.
section of the brain.
You do, because honestly, you know, one of the things that I don't think coaches truly understand is the importance of exposing the brain, constantly exposing the brain to different dynamics, different things, you know, just something to just get it out of its comfort zone, to start opening up and saying, wow, okay, I need to change gears.
So and then there we have some questions in the chat room, but I'm fascinated by this, because when we have guys that have massive TBI, let's say, and they can't move their hand, or they have it like clenched up in the fist, then they put the KAATSU bands on into cycle mode, and the therapists help them. And sometimes it only takes 5 or 10 minutes, and then they're moving. Now, I'm not talking a spinal cord injury. I'm talking a brain injury. So that autonomic nervous system response like that. And that's what you're doing, that you're working in that space with competitive athletes, which is
it's somewhat
awesome.
similar.
Yeah. Hey, we have a question. We have a couple questions, but here's one from Dan. Are you doing anything different with your swimmers in KAATSU because of coronavirus? Are the swimmers swimming less?
Just so that people understand, I mean, I essentially retired from being a deck coach in February. So, you know, during this whole coronavirus, I've not really been involved in, other than I teach at the golf academy right now, which is little kids, but I haven't really been that involved in coaching. So I don't have an answer to that, but I would know that a KAATSU work would maintain strength and patterns of movement very, very effectively. It really would. I imagine it would. There'd be no question that you'd have your kids into those environments. You know, if they had them on swim benches or pulley systems or tubing with, you know, that would maintain the functional power that they had when they were in the pool on a constant basis.
Got it. Okay. We had another guy join.
Just a
Stephen, I was
moment.
just saying Dr. Yu joined us as well, just so you know.
Chris Morgan, can you explain what you have been doing with your athletes, swimmers, during the Corona lockdown and KAATSU?
Yeah. So, and Jonty, I wanted to talk to you about this, and sorry I was late. And I will tell you that I met Jonty. He probably doesn't remember. He knows because I've told him when I was a young coach back in 1993 in Colorado Springs. He was trying golf back then, so it's been a long project. Yeah, so Jonty, really incredible is, with my exposure with KAATSU and KAATSU Aqua especially, we didn't have access to any pool. And so the kids that were familiar in my group with KAATSU, and actually some of them only having the KAATSU Aqua bands, which are not non-pneumatic, and something that here on the Alpha team we can talk about. We keep it a little more in-house just because there needs to be a lot more, I guess I'd say, supervision, Steve is a good word.
Yeah.
Or how to appropriately put on the pressure. Anyway, I'd say about 8 of my kids were very dedicated to using KAATSU during the time, doing simple things like adding KAATSU bands to their dryland practice, and Steven saw it, I had kids in endless pools using KAATSU bands, in the open water using KAATSU bands, because our time was a lot less. And what I have written down in a very, very scientific way in a notebook and pencil is we're now in the pool, and my kids are not as fit as they were before. They're more fit. I believe that they're faster than they ever were. Now, I think that there's an element that they actually have recovered a little bit from just being broken from me and kind of the old school side of swimming. But I have kids who, after 4 months of not touching water, a best time of a 146 200-yard freestyle, going 149 in practice. So I'm blown away at how fit they are right now. I don't know, Steve, if that answers it, but
Yeah.
Just we've been using KAATSU more than before, and it's incredible because aerobically I feel like they haven't lost very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Nally, a lifelong swimmer, asks, are there any differences between training mid-distance versus sprinters versus distance swimmers? Jonty, would you advocate modifying the sets in any way, like going hundreds instead of 25s?
I think the more, especially in this past year, the more I felt where the value of KAATSU came in when you're actually in the pool was this whole, where I've evolved and advanced to where it is managing and understanding and building power and strength in patterns of movement. So I don't think it matters what distance you swim. I think it matters when you train with KAATSU what distances you swim. And I don't think it's necessary I might hypothetically say I would KAATSU a swimmer, and then maybe the distance swimmers would swim, maybe 650s or 850s. To me, it's just about exposing the brain to what it's managing and how it's going to manage it, and then marrying the two together in that contrast style. So, doesn't matter the distance, doesn't matter the athlete physiology. I think the process would be fairly similar up and down the chain.
Thank you. Dr. Page, do you have any questions? And Dr. Yu?
No, I was a little late on the call, sorry, but I was fascinated how Jonty was mentioning, instead of thinking about, I'm training the lungs, the heart, or capacity, you're training the brain's autonomic nervous system, if you will, to manage those more efficiently. I love shooting, and I know that, some of my friends disagree. Oh, there's nothing like live firing. And I'm like, no, the skill is in dry firing. So your subconscious gets so trained, you don't have to think about like front sight targeting or whatever. You just do it. You have to think about it. So if you're training, it just got me thinking, if you're training your athletes so well, and you're manipulating the physiology or the brain, you know, the homunculus, right? Or the premotor cortex. It's firing so efficiently to the point where, you know, you're going to reach a threshold where, oh, I got to change things up for, like you said, neuroplasticity. I have to do KAATSU in a little different way, or, you know, just you're doing it so often, so well, and you're changing it up that, you know, you're constantly adapting, you know, that part of the brain, the subconscious, the neurology, to so the performance doesn't get stale, if you will. So, but I love that that you're kind of bypassing, oh, let's just pound, more reps. No, it's use the brain to your advantage. Yeah.
Glenn, did you have anything?
Gotta unmute myself. I was trying to find this. So I love the concept of this whole mental part of the training, and the idea of neuroplasticity. I highly recommend. That's what I was trying to do while you guys were talking about it. There's a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. I don't know if any of you have ever read that.
Fabulous audiobook.
Yeah. So, well, again, I've done it both ways, but there's also a video on I think it's Amazon Prime about it. But you know, the concept, especially to us in westernized medicine, is so foreign. I mean, it's kind of taken off recently. But you know, my father had a major stroke, and I wish I'd have known some of these concepts of, you know, him concentrating on the paralyzed side rather than, you know. So I like the concept. I have not honestly used those, and you're being, like I say, I'm a triathlete because I'm trying to be an athlete. I pretty much suck at everything. But I really like the concepts of it getting older, and as you know, get into your late 50s, it becomes more of a challenge to stay active. And I really like the idea and concept of KAATSU allowing me to do that and to hopefully even improve. I mean, I may not necessarily get a whole lot faster, but at least maintain. And these are new concepts for me. I'm a big visualization person. Again, I'm terrible at golf too, so I may have to try my KAATSU with my golf swing. But I love these concepts and ideas from elite people like yourselves.
Yeah. Jonty, just so you know, when I first met Dr. Sato, he separated KAATSU into three basic areas. One was the KAATSU cycle. So for the warm up, rehabilitation, warm down, KAATSU training, which is, you know, just constant pressure. But he also had a third area, and it was more difficult for me to get the information out of him because it was applied by the elite baseball, swimming, wrestling, et cetera, coaches in Japan. And he called it performance training. And performance training for him with KAATSU was almost exactly what you described, you know, purposeful movement, or he called it something like mindful movement with KAATSU.
Yep.
And then but he didn't go back. What they didn't do is they didn't go backwards and forwards. What they did was mindful movement and then raise pace, or, you know, whatever that movement was. They just did it once and twice. And I really like, you know, you're going back and forth to eliminate that noise and make that perfect movement. I think that's brilliant.
This accelerates it's the learning process.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's not easy. I mean, I've done this years and years as a coach. You know, when I work for USA Swimming, and I would show up at someone's pool, some university, and film athletes, and I'd sit down with the coach and the athlete, and I'd take them through all the things that were glaring errors. I mean, I'm called glaring errors. And they'd both sit there and go, wow, I had no idea that was going on. Yes, we got to change that. I'd give them some basic drills to help them change. And then I'd come back a month later. I'd see them in a competition a month later, and guess what?
Same thing.
Nothing had changed, right? So, you know, it wasn't a motor. It wasn't necessarily like as coaches, we think of a motor thing, you know, it had to be here, you know, so that's what led me to the very first book I read was Norman Doidge's The Brain That Changes Itself. It was the very first book I read.
Awesome.
And then from there, you know, that expanded to books and books and books on the brain and how it manages movement and that thinking. And then I'm one of those lucky people that I've had this pool of guinea pigs in front of me that I just kind of threw stuff at them. I'll leave you with one funny anecdote, but I always, you know, coaches have this, swimming coaches have this problem as they relate the way a shape moves through water. They always talk about the hand, and it's, you know, we're wired for hands and feet. We're absolutely wired for hands and feet in terms of neurology, but they always talk about the hand moving past the body. When we talk about patterns of movement, we always relate it that way. A coach might stand on deck and go, put your hand in the water this way, get a high elbow position, you know, and then the hand will move past the body as the coach traces the pattern. Well, the problem with that is the brain sort of wants to do it the same way. Instead, the coach should put the hand in the water and you basically walk his body past the hand, following those same patterns of changes in movement. That's the mistake. So, you know, the idea is that I wanted the kids to become more aware of their shape. I wanted them to become more aware of the flow of water around their shape. I wanted them to be sensitized to it. So I had this, I think he was a 10-year-old boy at the time. And I cut a whole bunch of these nylon strings. I mean, a whole bunch of them, you know, and I taped them onto his shoulders so they were flowing down his body and his legs on both sides. And I put a pair of fins on him, and I just wanted him to go down the pool, up and down the pool, and then come back to me and say, do you feel what's going on with these bands? I wanted the brain to become sensitized to these strands of string as they float around his body. At the same time, I was watching and filming on deck, watching how they changed based on the vortices as they came off his body. Well, to cut a long story short, what I used initially, very first day one, I used duct tape to put him on his shoulders. Well, that left this huge red welt on his shoulders. So I'm like, when he puts his shirt on at the end of the practice, I say, son, do not take your shirt off at home and don't tell your mom about your shoulders. But, you know, and the other time, when I took that to British swimming, and I had a really elite level breaststroke. I mean, he was on the British Olympic team. And I had taped this on his pecs, and I had Kitec tape at that time, so I had a non-invasive tape on him. So I put this Kitec tape with all these strands coming down because he's a breaststroker, and I wanted him to kind of feel flow. Well, I got him all taped up with the Kitec tape on his chest. It happened to be pink at the time, unfortunately, all these tassels hanging down, and all I got were hoots, cat whistles, and whistles from the kids in the audience. It looked like some kind of belly dancer. And that just threw it right out the window right there, because this kid, like, all of a sudden he goes from this thinking about, okay, this is real scientific, to, oh my God, I look like a belly dancer. So throw that one out the window. But I'm still really, really thinking about that concept. I mean, I still feel like it's a crucial concept for when swimmers start to realize that understanding that how this shape moves through water and the feel of how the flow of water over that shape. And if we can sensitize people to kind of sense that, then I think they change the paradigm of how they manipulate their anchoring positions as they vault the shape through the water.
Wow, that's great.
Hey, Jonty, I know. How are you doing on time? What's your?
Yeah, I got about 10 minutes, and I got to head out of here.
Okay.
If you have 10 minutes, one more question I was curious on is, you know, we on our products generally we go from 0 to 400 SKU, and you were mentioning, you know, you're in the a 200 range. Do you ever use a higher pressure or lower pressure to achieve what you want to achieve? How does pressure play a part of this?
The pressure played a part in that when I chose the pressure for contrast KAATSU, I went with the same concept that originally when I had kids warm up with a KAATSU band on their legs, at the time in talking with Chris and yourself, the rule of thumb was go to 2/3 of their training pressure. So that's what I did. If they were training with 240, they went to like 180 or somewhere in that range. And, you know, if they felt like that still wasn't the right comfort, I let them go lower, because ultimately I want them to kind of have this great feeling. It had more of a cognitive thinking, psychological plus, even though we know that it has physiological, you know, what it does physiologically to the flow. So I went with that same premise and went down that same path with this. And I felt like that was the right place to be for this specific type of thing. Because I feel like if you get to that point where the pressure's at a 7 or an 8, you know, in terms of the Borg scale, sometimes there was too much discomfort to really get to that good zone right away. Right. In the training side, folks, I had guys that could, you know, put their legs at the highest KAATSU rating you could put, and they'd still look at me and go, I'm not feeling anything. So, I mean, it's individual, right? It's all individual how people handle and deal with it. But
yeah, okay, thank you.
Are you using the armbands also for their swim technique, or are you just using, as far as in the pool, or are you just using that for their form?
I had them alternate. They alternate.
Okay. Okay, that would be very good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. Any, I'm just kind of throwing it out there. Is there any alibis, any questions that anyone wanted to ask Jonty before we lose him for today?
It's John. I have a question which
Okay.
is not swimming related, and you know, I know you don't have time, but just something for maybe us all to think about. And it's things we've talked about, but Jonty kind of just opened my eyes, as he always does. If we think of, you know, and we've had some examples, Jonty, in these last weeks of a fellow colleague of Steve and myself, a swim coach, working with people who are, was the gentleman had a stroke, Steve, I believe, and was able to move for the first time in 10 years. So I'm thinking as we get older, and you know, thinking of my own parents, as my mom says she loves to walk, and she just feels like she wants to walk that far, but she can't. So I'm thinking if I just start to have her walk with the KAATSU bands on, you know, is it the same thing where she's going to train her brain, and it's the race pain that I talk about, her walk brain, to be able to, when she gets tired, to be able to actually go further because her brain knows it can go further. I don't know if that made sense.
I put the KAATSU on her before she did the walk.
Yeah.
I'd prep her for the walk. I wouldn't walk with them on. I really wouldn't.
Yeah.
It's just my initial thought on that.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially when you're talking a little bit older, right?
Yeah.
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 Well, Stephen, before you close it, I just want to take this opportunity, Jonty. I know you're retiring out of the swim coaching world and swimming world, and all the way back to that day when I met you on the deck in Boca Raton. I just want to take this opportunity on behalf of a lot of swimmers, because I know you've touched and reached thousands of them. I want to thank you for what you've done for our sport, but more importantly, I want to thank you for what you've done from a leadership perspective, setting all those thousands of kids off on the right glide slope to approach their life. So thank you very much for everything you've done.
John, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not deck coaching anymore, but I'm staying involved. You know,
Awesome.
I mean, I will. You know, once this whole thing quietens down, I really want to just be a glorified grandpa consultant to programs. You know, that type of thing.
We'll keep using you.
I got a quick question. Does Jonty have a book coming out, I understand, or did I miss that? I'm sorry, I had to go see some patients.
Yes, I'm putting together, I don't know if it'll be a book, you know, because I'm just thinking about how to disseminate information into the media environments and the people today. It might really ultimately just be a website, brain training for swimmers, that then you can go in and pick and choose what you want to kind of look at. If I want to understand how to freestyle or this or brain training or contrast training, then you go and get what you want. You know, you might say, get the book, or you might get parts of the book, or you might just get one section type of thing. I mean, I think the predisposition for people, younger people today, is have a hard time sitting down reading through a book, you know. So the idea is if they can get something that they can sit down and absorb and gather in 10 to 20 minutes of reading, I think that the value in that is much higher, and they have something right there and then they can take and act upon within the space of a day, as opposed to going through a whole book. And, you know, I found sometimes people get sidetracked when they get into a book, and all of a sudden, you know, they don't even read the rest of the book because they get sidetracked in the first chapter, and, you know, they're off and running. So this way it'll be kind of like maybe a piecemeal kind of thing.
Great. Well, everybody, I am going to, we'll announce when Jonty's publicly launches his next stage of his career. So we'll keep everybody in tune. But Jonty, on behalf of everybody, thank you very, very much.
No, my pleasure. You're welcome. All right, gentlemen.
Take care.
Have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers.